I was pulling back on the control stick when the sky above San Francisco cracked like broken glass, and through that impossible fracture, I could see something that my mind refused to accept. The Mitsubishi A6M0 beneath me shuddered, as if the aircraft itself was terrified. The Nakajima Sakai engine missing beats while 20,000 feet below. The American city spread across the California hills like a glittering jewel that someone had just struck with an invisible hammer. The crack in the sky was perfectly straight, running from the eastern mountains to the Pacific Ocean, and through that tear in reality, light was pouring that belonged to no earthly source. It wasn't sunlight or fire or electric illumination. It was something older and more fundamental, the kind of light that might have existed before stars learned how to burn. My instrument panel was going insane, needles spinning wildly while the radio crackled with voices speaking languages I had never heard, some of them human, some of them decidedly not. Below me, the people of San Francisco had stopped whatever they were doing and were standing in the streets, their faces turned upward toward the fracture that was slowly widening above their city. From my cockpit, I could see them clearly despite the altitude, thousands of tiny figures pointing at the sky, some of them running, others frozen in place like statues. The Golden Gate Bridge looked like a child's toy spanning the bay, and the ships in the harbor had turned into the wind as if seeking escape from something they couldn't understand. But the most disturbing thing was the silence that had fallen over my radio frequency. Moments before, it had been filled with the chatter of my squadron returning from what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission along the American coast. Now there was nothing but static that sounded almost like whispers, and occasionally bursts of transmission in Japanese, so panicked and rapid that I couldn't make out the words. The crack was widening, and something was moving behind it, shadows that seemed to have substance, reaching down toward the city like fingers made of condensed darkness. My Zero was being pulled toward the fracture, despite my efforts to maintain level flight, and I could feel the aircraft's aluminum skin vibrating with harmonics that resonated in my bones. None of us knew this was only the beginning. What split the sky would soon split the truth between what we were told to see and what actually existed in the spaces between our world and whatever lay beyond. Stay with me until the end. You need to hear what happened next. And before we continue, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. To understand why the sky broke open that day, we need to go back. My name is Hiroshi Tanaka, and I was born in Kyoto in 1922, the third son of a family that had served the emperor for 7 generations. My father, Kenji Tanaka, was a master carpenter who built temple roofs with hands that understood wood the way other men understood mathematics. And my mother, Emiko, was a woman of such gentle strength that flowers seemed to bloom more vibrantly in her presence. I grew up in a house where duty and honor were not abstract concepts, but the air we breathed, the water we drank, the foundation upon which our entire existence rested. My earliest memory is of sitting in our family garden, watching my father repair a wooden gate that had been damaged in a spring storm. He worked with tools that had been passed down through generations of Tanaka craftsmen, each one worn smooth by decades of use. And as he worked, he explained to me that everything in the world had its proper place and purpose. Even the smallest nail, he said, holding up a tiny piece of metal, serves the larger structure. Without it, the whole gate would fail. I was 7 years old when I first saw an aircraft, a military biplane flying over Kyoto at low altitude during army maneuvers. The sound of its engine filled the sky like thunder, and I watched from our rooftop as it passed overhead. A machine that seemed to defy every law of nature I thought I understood. That night, lying in my futon, I dreamed of flying over mountains and oceans in aircraft that could touch the realm of the gods themselves. When I told my father about my dream, He listened with the careful attention he gave to all important matters, then nodded slowly. "The sky is calling you," he said. "But remember, Hiroshi, that those who fly carry great responsibility. They see the world as the gods see it, from above, where all human concerns appear small and temporary. This perspective can make a man wise, or it can make him forget that he is human." I joined the Imperial Japanese Navy at 18, driven by a combination of patriotic duty and the irresistible pull of aviation that had been building in my chest since childhood. Training began at the Kasumigara Air Group, where the reality of military flying quickly stripped away any romantic notions I had carried from my peaceful life in Kyoto. The instructors were veterans of the China campaign, hard men with thousands of hours in their logbooks and no patience for weakness or hesitation. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was the most beautiful and deadly aircraft I had ever seen. She was a masterpiece of engineering, with clean lines and a radial engine that could propel her to speeds that seemed impossible for something made of metal and canvas. But more than her performance, it was the Zero's spirit that captured my imagination. The way she responded to every input with the sensitivity of a living creature. The way she seemed to anticipate my intentions and translate them into graceful movement through three-dimensional space. My instructor, Lieutenant Commander Sato, was a veteran of Pearl Harbor with 9 confirmed kills to his credit. He taught me to think like the Zero, to understand that aerial combat was not about brute force, but about harmony between man and machine, about finding that perfect moment when skill and instinct and technology merged into something greater than the sum of its parts. "The Zero is not just an aircraft," he explained during one of our training flights over Sagami Bay. "She is an extension of your spirit, a physical manifestation of your dedication to the Emperor and to Japan. When you fly her, you carry the hopes and prayers of our entire nation. Never forget that responsibility." The months of training were brutal but exhilarating, filled with formation flying and gunnery practice and navigation exercises that tested every limit of human endurance. I learned to dogfight at 400 miles per hour, to navigate by stars across empty ocean, to function effectively while pulling G-forces that compressed my body and threatened to crush my consciousness into darkness. But more than technical skills, I learned to see aerial combat as a form of spiritual discipline, a way of transcending the limitations of earthbound existence and participating in something larger than individual survival. The Bushido Code that governed every aspect of our military service taught us that death was not an ending, but a transformation, and that a warrior's highest honor was to die in service to causes greater than himself. By the winter of 1941, I was qualified for combat operations, assigned to a carrier-based fighter squadron, preparing for what our commanders described as a decisive campaign that would secure Japan's rightful place as the dominant power in the Pacific. The details of our mission were classified at levels that made speculation dangerous, but we understood that we were preparing to strike at the heart of American military power in a way that would force the United States to accept Japan's vision of a new world order. The attack on Pearl Harbor succeeded beyond our most optimistic projections, crippling the American Pacific Fleet and establishing Japanese naval supremacy across thousands of miles of ocean. I flew in the second wave, strafing airfields and fuel depots, while American fighters struggled to mount an effective defense. The mission felt like destiny fulfilled, proof that our training and dedication had prepared us for this moment of historical significance. But victory at Pearl Harbor was only the beginning of a campaign that would eventually stretch Japanese forces across an area larger than the continental United States. Over the following months, our squadron participated in operations throughout the Pacific, supporting amphibious landings in the Philippines, covering bomber formations, attacking Allied shipping, engaging in dogfights with American and British pilots who seemed determined to match our skill and dedication with their own. The Americans were better opponents than our propaganda had led us to expect. Their pilots were aggressive and well-trained, their aircraft increasingly capable, and their industrial capacity seemed limitless. Every month brought reports of new American fighter types and bomber formations, and it became clear that the war we had started would not end with the quick, decisive victory our leaders had promised. By 1943, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. American forces were advancing across the Pacific in a series of amphibious campaigns that methodically captured key island bases and brought their bomber formations ever closer to the Japanese home islands. Our squadron was reassigned to homeland defense, flying long-range patrols along the coastline and intercepting American reconnaissance aircraft that appeared with increasing frequency. It was during one of these patrols, in the early morning hours of a fog-shrouded day in March 1944, that I encountered something that would change my understanding of warfare, reality, and my own place in the cosmic order. My flight of 4 Zeros was returning from a routine sweep along the Bonin Islands when we received orders to investigate unidentified aircraft detected by our radar stations near the American coast. The mission briefing was unlike anything I had experienced in 3 years of combat operations. Colonel Yamamoto, our group commander, provided coordinates and altitude information, but he offered no explanation for why Japanese fighters would be operating so far from home base, deep in American territorial waters. When Lieutenant Suzuki asked about the nature of the target, the colonel's response was cryptic and unsettling. "You are to observe and report," he said. "Under no circumstances are you to engage unless directly threatened. What you see during this mission is classified at the highest levels of Imperial Command. You will speak of it to no one, ever, under penalty of death." The flight across the Pacific took 5 hours, most of it over empty ocean that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single landmark to break its monotonous perfection. We flew at maximum altitude to conserve fuel, climbing through cloud layers that looked like mountain ranges made of vapor and light. The silence over our radio frequency was broken only by occasional position checks, and I found myself lost in the meditative rhythm of flight that had always been my escape from the harsh realities of war. As we approached the American coastline, the Pacific fog began to thin, revealing a landscape that looked like something from a dream. The California hills rolled away toward the interior in waves of gold and green, broken by valleys where cities nestled like jewels in settings of suburban perfection. It was my first close view of America, and I was struck by the prosperity and order that was visible even from our altitude. Roads that ran in perfect geometric patterns, houses that looked like miniature palaces, agricultural areas that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. San Francisco appeared through the morning haze like a vision from another world. The city climbed the hills surrounding the bay in terraced layers of white and pastel buildings, connected by bridges that spanned impossible distances with an engineering audacity that took my breath away. Ships filled the harbor, and I could see aircraft taking off and landing at military airfields that spoke of American industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Japan could hope to match. But what captured my attention was not the city itself, but the sky above it, a dome of blue that seemed somehow different from any sky I had ever flown through. The light had a quality I couldn't identify, and there were cloud formations that moved in patterns that defied meteorological explanation. As we approached our assigned observation area, I began to notice distortions in the air that made the entire landscape shimmer like a mirage. "Flight leader," Lieutenant Suzuki's voice crackled through my headphones. "Are you seeing this?" I was seeing it, but I couldn't process what my eyes were telling me. The sky above San Francisco was beginning to develop what looked like stress fractures, thin lines of darkness that appeared and disappeared like cracks in ice under pressure. The air itself seemed to be developing texture, becoming visible in ways that violated every principle of physics I thought I understood. "Maintain formation," I ordered. Though my own aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control, the Zero's engine was running rough, missing beats as if the fuel mixture was wrong, and my instruments were giving readings that made no sense. Altitude, airspeed, heading, everything was fluctuating wildly despite the fact that my controls felt normal. That was when the sky split open above the American city, and I realized that our mission was not reconnaissance, but witness to something that transcended human understanding. The crack appeared instantly, running from east to west across the dome of blue like a wound in reality itself. And through that impossible opening, light began to pour that belonged to no earthly source. The fracture was perfectly straight and impossibly long, extending from the mountains behind San Francisco to somewhere far out over the Pacific Ocean. Through the gap, I could see what looked like another sky, darker, filled with stars that moved in patterns too complex for human eyes to follow, and something else, something vast and intelligent that was looking back at us through the tear in our world. My Zero was being pulled toward the fracture, despite my efforts to maintain level flight, and I could feel the aircraft's aluminum skin vibrating with harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones. The radio filled with static that sounded almost like voices, speaking languages that predated human speech, and occasionally fragments of transmission in Japanese so panicked and rapid that I couldn't understand the words. Below me, the city of San Francisco had come to a complete stop. Traffic wasn't moving. Ships in the harbor were dead in the water, and I could see thousands of people in the streets, all of them looking upward at the impossible sight above their city. Some were pointing, others were running, but most were simply standing in place like statues, their faces turned toward the sky that was no longer the sky they had awakened to that morning. The crack was widening, and something was emerging from the space beyond. Not objects, but presences, shadows with substance that reached down toward the city like fingers of condensed darkness. Where they touched the ground, buildings flickered and changed, assuming architectural forms that belonged to no human civilization. Streets rearranged themselves into geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, and I could see people walking through the transformed areas as if nothing unusual was happening. If you're still with me, tell me in the comments if you would have stayed in the sky or turned back. My flight leader's voice cut through the static, urgent and confused. "All aircraft, RTB immediately. Repeat, return to base immediately." But I couldn't move. The Zero was no longer responding to my controls, held in place by forces I couldn't understand, while the transformation of San Francisco continued below. The crack in the sky was now so wide that I could see through it into what looked like an entirely different universe, one where the laws of physics operated according to different principles, and where intelligence took forms that existed beyond the boundaries of space and time as humans understood them. Through my canopy, I could see my wingmen struggling with their own aircraft, engines sputtering and cutting out as if the very air we were flying through had become toxic to mechanical devices. Lieutenant Suzuki's Zero was spinning out of control, its pilot unconscious or dead in the cockpit, while Lieutenant Hashimoto was fighting to maintain altitude as his engine consumed fuel at an impossible rate. But the most disturbing thing was what I could see happening to the people of San Francisco. Those who had been touched by the shadows emerging from the sky crack were changing, becoming something that was still human in appearance, but fundamentally different in essence. They moved with perfect coordination, as if they shared a single consciousness. And when they looked up at our aircraft, I could see that their eyes reflected the strange light pouring from the fracture above. I realized in that moment that I was witnessing something that would never appear in any military report or historical record. This was not warfare as humans understood it, but contact with forces that existed beyond the boundaries of our reality. The crack in the sky was not a weapon, but a doorway, and what was coming through that doorway was changing everything it touched into something new and alien and impossible to categorize. My engine finally gave up, coughing once before falling silent, and I began an unpowered glide toward the transformed city below. As I descended through layers of air that seemed to have different physical properties at different altitudes, I could see the extent of the changes taking place beneath me. Entire city blocks had been converted into structures that followed no earthly architectural principles, connected by bridges and walkways that curved through dimensions I couldn't perceive. At 5,000 feet, my aircraft's electrical systems failed completely, leaving me in a metal glider with no instruments and no communication equipment. But somehow, I could still hear the voices coming from the sky crack, not through my radio, but directly into my consciousness, speaking words in Japanese that I understood perfectly despite the fact that no human throat could have produced those sounds. "Do not be afraid," the voices said. "You are witnessing transformation, not destruction. Your species is being prepared for participation in something greater than the small conflicts that divide your world." I wanted to respond, to ask questions, to demand explanations, but my voice wouldn't work. All I could do was continue my descent toward a city that was no longer entirely located in the reality I had known since birth. As I passed through 3,000 feet, I could see clearly into the streets of transformed San Francisco, where humans and something not quite human worked together on projects that seemed to involve restructuring the fundamental nature of matter and energy. At 1,000 feet, my Zero's controls suddenly responded again, and I was able to level out and begin a long glide toward the bay, where the water still looked normal, despite everything that was happening on land. As I approached the surface, the crack in the sky began to close, and the strange light gradually faded until only normal daylight illuminated the city below. But San Francisco was forever changed. Even as the sky returned to its normal blue dome, I could see that certain areas of the city remained transformed. Buildings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, streets that led to places that couldn't be reached by ordinary travel, people who walked with the fluid grace of those who had learned to move through realities that intersected but never quite merged. I managed to ditch my Zero in the bay and swim to shore, where American military personnel were waiting with weapons drawn and questions I couldn't answer. They found nothing unusual about my aircraft, except that its engine had suffered catastrophic failure from unknown causes. The instrument panel showed no record of the impossible readings I had witnessed, and the radio equipment had been completely fried by what the technicians described as electromagnetic anomalies of undetermined origin. The interrogation lasted 3 days, during which I told them nothing about what I had actually seen. How could I explain that their city had been briefly transformed by contact with intelligence from beyond human reality? How could I describe the crack in the sky that had served as a doorway between worlds? Who would believe that some of their fellow citizens were no longer entirely human, having been changed by exposure to forces that transcended the boundaries of normal existence? They eventually classified me as a prisoner of war and transferred me to a camp in Colorado, where I spent the remainder of the conflict wondering if I had witnessed something real or simply suffered a breakdown under the stress of long-range combat operations. The other prisoners treated me with the respect due to a fellow warrior, but I could see in their eyes that they knew something was wrong with me, that I carried knowledge of something that had broken my connection to the world we had all shared before that morning above San Francisco. The war ended in 1945, and I was repatriated to Japan, where I found a country that had been transformed by defeat almost as thoroughly as San Francisco had been transformed by contact with forces beyond human understanding. But the Japan I returned to was still recognizably the place of my birth, while the memories I carried of that morning above the American city belonged to a reality that existed parallel to but separate from the world everyone else inhabited. For 70 years, I have kept silent about what happened in the sky above San Francisco, convinced that speaking would either mark me as insane or reveal truths that humanity was not prepared to accept. But I am 92 years old now, and most of the men who flew with me are dead, and I believe that some experiences are too important to die with the people who witnessed them. The crack in the sky was not an isolated incident. Over the decades since the war, I have collected accounts from other pilots, American, British, German, Russian, who have witnessed similar phenomena in skies around the world. Breaks in reality that last for minutes or hours before sealing themselves, doorways through which intelligences from other dimensions briefly make contact with our reality, transformations of landscapes and populations that are forgotten as soon as they end. What I saw above San Francisco was not invasion but invitation, contact from beings who exist in dimensions adjacent to our own and who occasionally reach across the boundaries between worlds to offer participation in something larger than the conflicts that divide our species. The people who were changed that morning were not victims, but volunteers, chosen to serve as bridges between realities that touch but seldom merge. I never returned to Kyoto. The house where I grew up was destroyed during the firebombing campaigns of 1945, and my parents died believing that their third son had been lost in combat over the Pacific. I built a new life in America, working as a translator and interpreter, while carrying memories of a morning when the sky split open above a city that briefly became something more than human ambition had ever imagined. The nightmares faded over the years, replaced by dreams of flying through skies where the boundaries between dimensions were fluid, and where aircraft moved not by pushing against air, but by riding currents of possibility that flowed between parallel realities. In those dreams, I am still 22 years old, still flying a Zero through skies that extend far beyond the horizon, still serving as witness to transformations that transcend the small conflicts of nations and species. Some memories don't fade, they wait. Subscribe so these stories are never buried again.